Welcome to Move the Sticks. I am Bucky Brooks. I'm here with my man LZ doing it. So kind of the dream team all over again. Lance and I, and can't forget Mike Gann. We held it down, did all the NFL channel coverage of the draft. And it was a fascinating weekend watching all the names come and those things. And Lance, look, the weekend was great. But since the weekend, it has been a fascinating discussion on X about drafts and evaluating drafts, but more importantly, the consensus board. The consensus board that evidently I didn't know about that is like secret life. Let's talk about it. Like, one, what did you know about consensus board leading up to the weekend? Just kind of let the people know about it because it's catching a lot of buzz right now.
Yeah, so the first time I saw this was Arif Hassan, and he's now with the Athletic, and he's been covering the Minnesota Vikings for years. And Arif started like compiling, all of my grades.
Hmm.
He started compiling grades from Dane Brugler, and then people who do
Hmm.
large scale, not just 100 players or whatever, the larger scale. And he was collecting people from around the internet who had larger scale, and he tried to keep it as as kind of as credentialed as possible as people who have a reputation for doing it at a decent quality level. And so he started. I want to say this is like 5 years ago that he started putting it all together and saying, well, this is kind of what the consensus is. And it was interesting to me because I've got my own opinions,
Hmm.
but then it was like, okay, now you're part of a sample size of 4, 5, 7 people. And so it would say, well, this is the consensus of where they think he's going to go, a high of this high and a low of this low. And so here's kind of the midpoint. Here's kind of the consensus. And so that was the first time I saw general ideas of larger scale players come into play. Now, what I want to say is when I look at the consensus, I try to get, and I totally appreciate that consensus. It's what you can work on. You don't have what all the teams are going to do. So what are you going to do? You can only use what you have available with your media members, and I'm part of that little thing that and you're part of it, but you don't do the largest scale because if you did, everything you did would be thrown in the midst in the mix, and you'd be part of that larger consensus board where you say, well, this guy had a consensus was going 164, but he ended up going to 85. That's a reach, right? Well, we don't have, as you know, Bucky, I'm preaching to the choir. We don't have medicals. We don't
Hmm.
have character stuff. We don't have conversations with the college that they came from or colleges. We don't know how they're handling NIL money and NIL situations. We don't know about family or friends who hang on, kind of hangers
Hmm.
on, and are they going to be problems where you travel? Because as you know, doing the scouting, that's the kind of stuff you have to do. I don't know if a lot of people realize they think scouting is, you're just grinding on tape. You're like a private investigator as a
Yeah.
regional scout. And you can maybe talk about that, what your job is when you're a regional scout, because you got to figure out who the person is.
Yeah, so much of that, and look, I love hearing that because, um, obviously we're all aware of the people that do great work in this space, right? The people that put it down and scout and put rankings and boards and mock drafts together. And I'm actually glad to hear you talk about boards because so much of some of the conversation online is about mock drafts, and what you're hoping is that people understand. No, this is a long drawn out thing. So even though you and I can talk about mock drafts or whatever, when we grade the players, we're grading the players based on how we think they're going to play in 2 to 3 years. And if
Right.
everyone else is really operating on that premise, that's one thing. And as a area scout, like one of the things that you're assigned to do is my job is to grade the player based on what the things we prioritize in our building. So what the Jaguars prioritize is different than what the Bills prioritize, and that's different than what the Texans prioritize. So every draft board that you see in a room is going to be vastly different based on the priorities and what they want. That said, I think it's fascinating that you and I can share conversations, and you can make me, hey, I need to, hey, have you seen this player? Have you seen that player? What do
Yeah.
you think about this and that? And you scrimmage it out. What I am so fascinated by when it comes to the consensus board, so much of the conversation, I would say on the NFL side, has been, A, be an independent thinker, be a critical mind. Don't allow herd mentality to seep into your reports. Some guys would go so far as to, if we are all at Penn State and they have a couple different rooms, well, I'm not going to sit in the same room with Lance and Dane and those guys because I don't want the conversation to seep into my note taking in my reports, because then it's not my report, it's like an aggregate report. And so like that, and that is why like it can be confusing a little bit when you hear people talk about, oh, the consensus board, and you need to look at this board and that board, because old school guys would say, no, 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 you don't want to do that because it blends into your belief system, to the point where I know of teams that don't even allow their grades to be revealed to each other, because they're scared that seeing the grade that somebody's high or somebody's low will make some of the other guys change their grades, because they want to be in line with the decision makers, as opposed to standing on business and saying, no, this is what I think about.
Yeah, which is totally different than, you're right, and it's human nature. I want to point out it's human nature. Let me tell you. So, Bucky, let's say none of us did mock drafts until mock draft 4. Nobody. There's no mock draft 1, 2, 3,
Yeah.
4. Nobody in the space. Nobody at ESPN, NFL, The Athletic. Nobody. And you got one mock draft, and it doesn't come out until
Woo!
Wednesday. Do you know how different that would be? Do you know how different
much
that would be? Because you're right. You do take man. Everyone's plugging this guy in here. That actually makes good sense. Or maybe they know something. Or where there's smoke, there's fire. Or that guy Pete Schrager's pretty tied in. You know what I'm saying? If you didn't have all of that at your disposal, to your point about herd mentality, so we are all hearing. They always say, "Don't scout with your ears," right?
Yeah.
There's always herd mentality that creeps in. And I don't know if people really talk about that with the idea of quote unquote consensus board. Sometimes there are just, somebody may not feel like they're great on offensive line. And so they may say, well, I'm kind of rolling with Lance, whatever he says. Well, I may not hit this guy right. You know what I'm saying?
Nah.
There's no guarantee I'm hitting any of these guys right. But I do think there are times where people will kind of just go with herd mentality, and they say, okay, I'm going to do my rankings 1 through 300. And I'm affected not by what I saw on tape or whatever. I'm just impacted by what everyone else's opinion is. So there's herd mentality inside. It's naturally built out inside the consensus board. There's no way around it. I've been part of it. I've been, man, I'm too low on this guy, or I'm too high on this guy. And then, like you and I talked about, Bucky, if you just stick with your initial, but usually you stick with your initial tape watch, you're like, damn it, I should have just stuck with what I thought, in December or January, instead of letting other things have an impact on me. So I just want to point out that that the consensus board is also, privy to her. I mean, is also can be biased by a herd mentality, whether it's intentional or not. And if you had no mock drafts until Wednesday, they came out on Wednesday or Thursday, it would look substantially different for everyone.
So I've said this, Lance. There are a few different things. One, the grading system and your board would look different if we made everybody put the pencils down before the combine. Meaning, if the combine is February 24th, I want all of your final grades in. I want everything done by that point, because then it is strictly off of how they played and how they performed. You're not influenced and impacted by anything that you see in the underwear Olympics. So that is one thing that stands out. Secondly, I want everyone to understand the origins of kind of like the consensus boards or the things that played out. When I worked at the Carolina Panthers, because this is the first time I was exposed to it, it didn't happen when I worked with the Seahawks, and the Seahawks were a direct reflection of Ron Wolf, John Snyder, Scott McLuhan, Ted Thompson. That's the crew that I learned how to scout under. When I go to Carolina after my third year in Seattle, in the back of the room leading up to the draft, they had a wall that had 7 names. And those names were the 7 most prominent guys that ran mock drafts. And back then, it was Rick Gosselin, it was Mel Kiper.
Yeah.
Gary Horton may have just been kind of kicking up and doing some things.
Gosling was really tied in at one point, yeah.
So what we did, Jay Glazer was a part of it. And so what we did is we wanted to see their mock drafts because we knew those people were tied into people. And we used that information because we were like, oh, that information is gold. If you think about how connected Jay Glazer is, you think about Rick Gott, like those guys, when they said it it was like the gospel.
Shoot,
So you
Nolan
like
Naraki used to be really tied in too when he was at
Joel
Oklahoma.
Bushbaum.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Joe
Joel
Bushbaum,
Bushbaum and all those guys.
easy tight end.
So
Yeah.
so when those guys, they were not only scouting on their own, they were ear hustling and doing it. So what we were doing is we would have an aggregate of those 7 mock drafts just to be like, "Oh, okay, these are names that are popping up. Let's make sure we're good on these names or whatever." Now, it didn't change the way that we graded, but it was like, "Hey man, Joe Smith keeps popping up for this guy in the first round. We got him down in the 5th round. Are we good on that?" And we would have a brief discussion about it, and then we would move on. And so it was more so a little bit of a checks and balances, but it wasn't, "Hey, if everyone is saying this, we need to say this as well because this is what it is." It literally is part of a process to make sure that you're thorough in your evaluations and your assessments. So when you do go on draft day, you know exactly how you feel and what you wanna do.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with teams. Look, this idea that they have to stick to a consensus or whatever. I mean, people saying that don't get fired if they're not good on a draft. You know what I'm saying? Like, I have no problem with people whose jobs are on the line, whose family's future is on the line, where their kids are going to go to school. If daddy gets fired or whatever, I got no problem. Like, to me, do you? Because it's your job on
Mhm.
the line. It's not my job on the line. How this draft turns out or where I have guys rated. That's your job that's on the line. Um, I, I understand the concept. When you make it very small and you say, well, you're straying from the consensus board. I can see where that would be. I don't want to say demeaning, but I could see that would be a little offensive to teams who have all this additional information that we don't have. And by the way, they have analytics, they have AI that they're leveraging in their buildings. It's much more advanced than that some of you might think who are listening. But it still doesn't change. Like, if you just say, boy, that feels like a real reach.
Mhm.
Sometimes picks feel like reaches. Now, when you say because of the consensus board, then it feels like to teams, it feels like, oh, because you guys thought it was one thing. But I mean, we're just working off of what we have, which is opinion in the general space. But I can tell you this, after day 2, I got a text from a general manager who told me he thought it was the Wild West in day 2. Like, he had never seen a day 2 like that. So that was NFL. Those are NFL people saying that about this draft. And when I put
Yeah.
together, Bucky, my round projections, this is not on where I necessarily will think all of them will go. I'm working with teams and I work with a variety of people on different
Mhm.
positions and whatnot.
Yep.
And I've done this for years and years. And then I've got some agents who also help me out along the way. So when I put my draft projections on NFL.com for every player, and I have to wait until,
Mhm.
like, I feel
The
bad for
very end.
Jack Andre. I
Yeah.
said, I got to wait until, like, I can start sending you stuff. And Dan Parr, who's my editor, I can start sending y'all stuff like 3 weeks out. But that's when I really start to try to lock in on where these guys are going to go. This is what I'm hearing from the league. Like, this is what I consider to be a league, but you can say consensus, but I'm not talking to enough people to make it necessarily a consensus. If I get DBs from one place, I might double check some from another place, but I'm not doing it with 8 teams. I mean, ain't nobody have time for that, and they're not gonna work with me for that long. Like, you have to kind of pick and choose. Um, so the idea of the consensus board, I think there is a consensus board, but publicly it's going to be different than what the teams have. But the only reason this became a thing is because it turned into you're straying from the consensus board. If someone had never said that phrase and just said it
Mhm.
feels like you were reaching, no one would have blinked an eye.
Yeah, and the funny thing about all this, and this is where it's really because we talk about the importance of going back and looking at where we were right, where we were wrong a year, 2, 3 years down the line. What happens, though, and I think that's probably the frustrating part for guys inside the league, you never hear the outside noise admit to being wrong about someone that they advocated over the weekend.
Right.
"Oh, man, this guy, he got to go in the second round." And then 2, 3 years later when he's out the league, you never hear people say, "Hey, man, you know what? I tricked that one off. I was off on that." And I think there has to be that because as much as we think these guys are slam dunks, they're not. And particularly, like, I tell you, Lance, like, is really the first and second round. If you look at the number of Pro Bowl players, and we'll use Pro Bowlers as kind of like the barometer in terms of determining who's elite or who's the best of the best, by 2 times the number of Pro Bowlers come from the first and second round. If you look at the rounds after that, 3 through 7, I mean, you're talking about less than 100 over the last 15 years have been Pro Bowl players that have come from that round. So as much as we talk about and get excited about the third, fourth, fifth round, sixth round pick,
Right.
the odds are they're not going to make it as much as we hope they're going to make it. The odds are not in their favor that they're going to make it
Once you get
and carve out
outside
an
the
elite career.
once you get outside the first 100, we'll call it first 100 for the first 3 rounds. The grading is so different from team to team, like where they have these guys based on scheme fit, based on positional norms, height, measurable norms that they have. Because some
Yeah.
people won't take certain lean mass numbers, other
Yeah.
teams covet lean mass, some teams covet certain 3 cones. So the boards are so drastically different once you hit rounds 4 through priority free agent that doesn't bother me at all. It is a little strange this year because the second round, as you said, that's a money round. That one was crazy because we never see tight ends go like that. So that's what was
Never.
newsworthy.
Never. And I will say this about the tight end thing, and this is why any aspiring scout not only needs to look at college tape, but he has to understand what the league is going to. And the reason why you want to look at pro tape is because you need to see what's playing, but also you need to see what's trending. And anyone that watched the league last year, you saw the explosion of 12 and 13 personnel, particularly 13 personnel with the LA Rams. One back, 3 tight ends on the field. You saw a bunch of guys playing. And this is a direct response to the Rams having a lot of success. And the Rams going to that is a direct response to everybody trying to use the Vic Fangio stuff with 2 high safeties, light boxes, light defenders. And the longer we are around the league, the more things go in cycles. So it went from, oh, we're going to throw it all the time. Defense, let's put all the light guys on the field. Oh, they got too many light guys on the field. We can't produce big plays. We got to go back to running the football for play action. And it just goes
Yeah.
around and around and
It's
around and
boxing,
around.
Bucky. It's just
We
counter
go.
punching, is all it is.
I mean,
It's just counter
that's
punching. And you know what's coming next is we're already seeing it. There will be a greater emphasis. We saw some of it this year, but Tre'Dan Stukes, you can call him a safety if you want, but he's probably going to play nickel. Keontae Scott is a nickel. You can call him a safety if you want. Caleb Downs
yeah.
is going to be a nickel. You know why? Third safeties. And why are they doing that? You go heavy, we're going to be able to cover and help stop the run with, instead of having a 185-pound guy in the slot, we're going to have somebody 205 who also has some ball skills. So that's going to come up, that's going to come up next, I'm sure. And we're going to start seeing people really go under center. I think we're going to start seeing a return
It's
to
gonna
a
go back to
few more.
it's gonna go back to old school ball.
Yeah.
It's gonna go back to old school. Hey, let's get up under center. Let's go back to controlling. We're throwing it too much. We're doing too much. We got to get back to running the ball. It's interesting because in my top fives that were on NFL.com, I had to expand the categories. And it's funny, Lance, I kicked myself because 2 weeks leading up to the draft, I had expanded to where I had the nickel corner, the safety. I had 2 different types of defensive ends. People will say, "Why'd you have 2 different?" You got edges and outside linebackers. I was like, look, I'm trying to get more names on the board
Yeah.
because all these guys are viewed. And the one category, because I went and I talked to one of the editors, I was like, man, I feel like I need to add another category at tight end. I had Eli Stowers and all these other guys, but I was like, I feel like there are more names that I should populate. So it would
Right.
be the Y tight end and the F tight end. And those are the things that we're going to have to get used to, that more positions are going to be in play as the league continues to counterpunch to react to the things. After the break, we'll be back to wrap up the episode. All right, LZ, I cut you off because you had something on the tip of your tongue. What were you about to shoot?
No, I think that's really important that you differentiated, when last we left. So you got DNs, right? So I now have differentiated, but I was just checking to my draft tracker that they put together, and they just put everybody in edge.
Yeah.
On my own personal grades, my master list, I have D end and I have edge. If I feel like you can play in a 3-4, if you're 275, 280 pounds, like Keldrick Falk to me is not an edge. I would call him a DE.
That's what it is. So they made me change it. because they didn't like that. And I gave them
Yeah.
that explanation. They were like, well, it sounds the same. I said, okay, let's just do edge and outside linebacker. And the way that I broke them up, my outside linebackers were the guys that I felt like were more of our 2-point stance, 3-4 outside linebackers that were the rush in or the rush backer, whereas the guys that I put on the edge were the 4-3 base ends that play like that. So Keldrick Falk was a base end. Ruben Bain was a base end. David Bailey was an outside linebacker for me. So that's how I
Yeah.
kind of split those guys up.
Yeah. I've seen IDL and ODL, I mean, outside
Yep.
defensive line and inside defensive line. I've seen that. I mean, you can just say edge. And I think edge and an IDL. I'm like, okay, then that's a true 3-4. That's a true. I could get with edge, Keldrick Falk, and IDL. I'm going maybe a little bit bigger players through 285 pounds. I would make LT Overton. Personally, I'd make him an IDL. Now, I think you have to project him there because he was a defensive end at Alabama. But those are just an example of the F and the Y. You really have to break them up now because everyone's starting to go back to the heavy Y. It used to be you couldn't find. You might have 2 Ys drafted in an entire draft, the inline tight end, 2 max. Now, Nate Berkshire went in the second round. Sam Roush went in the third round. Like Will Kazmarek went in the third round. These guys have value. All of a sudden, they have real value. The combo tight end is making a comeback. And the Fs, it seemed like in this draft, it was like, yeah, the Fs are nice little. Those are nice little gimmicks. But we want somebody who can block too, so we can go true heavy personnel, 12 and 13. So it's fascinating to watch, as you mentioned, Buck, the trends of the league. I try to keep up with the trends of the game because that informs how draft trends are going to change. I spend a lot of time on drafthistory.com and looking at how the histories look in each draft so I can project what rounds, where players are going to typically go. Players who look a certain way, players who play a certain way, players who have an athletic profile that falls in a certain category. You can go to drafthistory.com, look at old drafts, and if you kind of know who those other players were who were drafted, you start to see patterns develop of when different players go. But this year was such an outlier. Number one, I think it didn't have great talent in it. So I think that's one of the reasons it was kind of a crazy draft, and it may be an outlier draft. But secondly, what we're seeing though is a second year in a row where you're going to have you did have a second quarterback slip into the first round. You did Jackson Dart and obviously this year Ty Simpson, but then nothing in the second. I mean,
and you said this. You said this on our show. Like, hey man, it's a first and third round league. Either we feel good enough about you that we want to take you in the first round and make you the franchise guy, or you're going to be clearly a developmental guy that we take in the third round.
Line of demarcation.
And that is the line of demarcation, and that is what we're seeing. And look, man, I think this is fascinating. I'm so glad to have you on. I'm looking forward to you being on the Move to Six podcast each and every week for the next few weeks as we go forward. And we're going to pick up the discussion where we left off when we get back together on Move the Sticks on Monday. For LZ and Bucky Brooks, this is Move the Sticks. We will chat with you guys.